Well, the Pac-12 has a chance to get in the college football playoff, but what about the rest of the bowl games? Could they have two teams in the New Year's Six games this year? Maybe.
You are Locked On Pac-12, your daily podcast on the Pac-12 Conference. It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On Pac-12. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thanks so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with all things about the Pac-12. Like, comment, subscribe, please, if you haven't already, wherever you're listening to or watching the show, which today is brought to you by Sling TV. Don't miss this week's matchup between... Well, there's a lot of matchups to watch. Whoever your favorite team is, whoever they're playing, the biggest one in the Pac-12, of course, being Oregon and Washington right here on Sling. The TV you love for a price you love. Try it today. You notice I probably cut myself off just a little bit in that intro, using a different streaming service here because we want the best connection possible for my guy Carter Bahns of beaverblitz.com to talk about everything going down in the Pac-12. I've seen all your comments about that. We're always working. We're always trying. This is our latest iteration. We're switching streaming services here. We're just making it work. But Carter, regardless, we're always ready to talk Pac-12. Are we not?
And we're hopping over to my happy place here on the other streaming service, the one that I use on the regular, so I'm a little bit more at home as well too. Hopefully everyone can hear me and I'm not all choppy, and on the video side nothing's laggy. I don't know what the deal is. We've tried pretty much everything in our power.
Yeah, we're at our wits' end, so hopefully it goes well today. But the Pac-12, I think, has a really good-looking shot at the playoff at the moment. It's all contingent. Everything is upon having a one-loss conference champion, but you've got three teams right now that could conceivably do that. And I feel bad for Utah because they had those expectations coming into the season. I still think they're a good enough team to be in that playoff discussion. I still think they could beat Oregon. I still think they could win the Pac-12. I'm not saying they will, but I think they could. But they just had that unfortunate loss to Florida. If that goes the other way, there's four teams that could get it, but nevertheless, there are three. But an interesting thought, and I gave you credit for getting my mind going in this particular direction, is let's say the Pac-12 gets a team into the playoff. Let's say maybe even if they don't. We know whoever wins the conference regardless will play in the Rose Bowl. But I could see a number of scenarios playing out where you've got two Pac-12 teams playing in New Year's Six Bowls this year because that's the position the conference is currently in with USC, UCLA, and Oregon.
And I think it's the most likely if Oregon and USC meet in the Pac-12 title game. You know, you get your two highest ranked teams at that point into the title, whether the winner goes to the playoff or the Rose Bowl. I think that the odds are extremely likely that the Pac-12 does get two teams into the New Year's Six just because you're essentially guaranteed a spot if you finish the season in the top 12. And a two-loss Oregon team or a two-loss USC team that makes it to the Pac-12 title game, and one of those losses is to each other, a top 10 team at that point, the resume there is enough to keep you in the top 12, I would assume, especially if you're losing to a team that is qualifying for the playoffs. So I am... the last couple of weeks as I've been looking through the bowl selection process and some of the predictions that are out there and making my own, I have thought for a few weeks now that it's fairly likely that the Pac-12 gets a couple of teams in the national spotlight there in the New Year's Six. And I think as the season progresses and these teams just continue to win, the likelihood becomes stronger.
And I'm with you as well on it being Oregon and USC the most likely to generate that tandem, because the loser of the Pac-12 championship game would probably, if it's Oregon and one of the LA schools, would be 11-2. And if you don't think that what we're talking about is possible here by the time the season comes to a close, ask yourself this question. How often has an 11-2 Power 5 football team not gotten an at-large bid to a New Year's Six game? So I don't know where the playoff sites are this year, but of course there are other big bowl games for a Pac-12 team to try to showcase itself. And by the way, because I'm always forward thinking and, pondering the thoughts that will come into your heads or perhaps in the comments section on YouTube, I do think it matters how often the Pac-12 gets a chance to play on the national stage when you're trying to continue to build up the conference's reputation. I know, the teams involved, USC and UCLA, but look at it. Let's say you have, USC and Oregon went out and they meet in the Pac-12 championship game. And then USC beats Oregon, and maybe they go to the playoff. If Oregon is then there playing in a big game, that's a better look for the Pac-12, right? Because you have an opportunity to play a high-quality opponent. You're going to have a lot of people watching that game, and if you can win, if you're George Kliavkoff, that's always what you want. Sure, there's little bits of money that factor into it as well, but I don't think at this point, with the Pac-12, who hasn't won a bowl game in the last 2 seasons, by the way. Last time the conference had a bowl victory was Oregon's Rose Bowl win over Wisconsin in 2020, after the 2019 regular season. And when you're talking about these conferences and how strong they are and how weak they are and whatnot and all that sort of discussion, I don't think you can overlook the fact that a legitimate punch, proverbially, of course, that people throw is the Pac-12 hasn't won a bowl game in the last couple of years. They're behind other conferences. I think that's a very real conversation to have.
Peach Bowl and Fiesta Bowl are the playoff bowls this year. I just pulled that up. So essentially guarantees, not necessarily, it doesn't entirely guarantee it, but it's pretty likely we'll see a Pac-12 team in the Rose Bowl. Usually the only time that doesn't happen is when the Rose Bowl is part of the playoff. But even if Oregon or USC get into the college football playoff, it's not entirely unlikely that you would see the runner-up of the Pac-12 get into the Rose. We've seen that happen before, haven't we?
I believe, I want to, who played in the Rose Bowl when Oregon and Washington went to the playoff?
I can think of one year where it was like a Big 12 and Big 10 team that played, and I can't remember what the circumstances were.
I think it was like
I don't think it's a guarantee that they would take the runner-up, but part of me feels like we've seen that before.
So in 2000, so Stanford did go in 2014. Or no, 15 is when Oregon went to the playoff, and that game was at the Rose Bowl. So then 16 was when they went there, and Stanford did go to the Rose Bowl, and they played Iowa. But Washington was the team that got into the college football playoff. Okay. So that has happened before. I think that's really likely. And I love the history of the Rose Bowl. I mean, it's the best. If you're not in the college football playoff, getting to a major bowl game, I think, can do good things for your program. Obviously, not as much as potentially playing in the program. I think there is an interesting debate, and I know that Oregon fans are having this pretty often. Is it better to go and play in a great game in the Rose Bowl or go get blasted in the college football playoff? It's a tough question to answer, and that's where I jump to. Like, would it have been better if Utah had been able to win a couple of those games early, gotten into the playoff, and then probably been blown out by Georgia? Like, I don't know. They went there and they almost beat Ohio State, and it was pretty respectable, and then some.
Yeah, and I think we heard that conversation continue into the offseason too about, some of the national pundits were like, hey, remember what Utah just did in the Rose Bowl? Like, that was a Rose Bowl we'll never forget. Like, I know that they came up short against Ohio State, but everybody for months after that game even was talking about how good Utah looked and how Utah has arrived because they finally made a Rose Bowl and because they looked good in doing it.
Right.
And I don't think we're talking about that into June if they go and lose by 40 to Georgia in the college football playoff semifinals.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I have one more thought on that as well, with regards to getting in the playoff versus playing in a big time at New Year's Six or a really good bowl game. Or the Cotton Bowl is among the New Year's Six now, right? Cotton and Peach were the additions.
Yeah, and that's the most likely if two Pac-12 teams get into the New Year's Six and one of them is not in the playoff. Pac-12 team would most likely go to the Cotton Bowl.
Yeah, but there's another thought that I want to share with all of you after I talk to you all about Simply Safe. This episode is brought to you by Simply Safe. If you've thought about securing your home with home security, you've got to get Simply Safe. You've been putting it off. This is the direction that you want to go. This is their biggest offer of the year. Locked On Pac-12 listeners can order the #1 rated Simply Safe home security system for 50% off. In an emergency, 24/7 professional monitoring agents use Fast Protect technology exclusively from Simply Safe to capture critical evidence and verify the threat is real so you can get the priority police response. Don't miss your chance to save big on the only security system that I recommend, Carter 2. Get 50% off any new Simply Safe system at simplysafe.com/lockedoncollege. This is their biggest discount of the year, so don't wait. That's simplysafe.com/lockedoncollege. There's no safe like Simply Safe. The other thought that popped in my head when talking about the New Year's Six Bowl and Utah being there and that legitimizing them in the eyes of many, which I completely agree with, is could you make the case, Carter, it's more valuable for a team like Utah that was a Pac-12 expansion team, formerly in the Mountain West? Now, they played in a Sugar Bowl, back in their Mountain West days, but since they'd gotten to the Pac-12, that was the first time they'd won the conference, first time they'd played in the Rose Bowl ever. Do you think it's more valuable for a school like that than, say, a USC or an Oregon who have, played in national championship games? Obviously, USC has won several of them. Like, if the Trojan, let's say Oregon wins out and goes to the playoff, which I don't think is super likely, but let's just say hypothetically that takes place. They beat USC and the Trojans get to go to the Rose Bowl. Do you think USC fans are excited about the opportunity to play in that game after the down years that they've had? Or do you think that it would be more, well, this isn't really what we are wanting to eventually accomplish with Lincoln Riley? Because they did play in that great Rose Bowl game against Penn State, and it gave a little bit of fodder to the idea that, oh, well, now USC is back.
Yeah, this year in particular, I think USC fans would be, I mean, I can't speak for the fan base, and I know that they have extremely high and sometimes outrageous expectations for the program. But this year, it feels like as they continue to build their way back up, a Rose Bowl would be, I think they would take a Rose Bowl. I think they'd take an appearance. I think they'd take a Rose Bowl win. Obviously, the end goal for any national contender now is to make the playoff. And we could go in depth on that and how we have delegitimized bowl games and how bowl season means nothing and how the college football playoff is the talk of the world and not these traditionally great bowl games like
you won't hear that from me, Carter. You will not hear any of that fodder from me.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm still I love the college football playoff, don't get me wrong, but I am here
I love bowl
every
season.
Single bowl game. I'm here for the Gasparilla Bowl. I'm here for the Bad Boy Mowers Bowl. I mean, bring them on. Give me all of these bowl games. Give me the matchups between Conference USA and the Sun Belt. I love every bit of it. And to me, maybe this is just being, an Oregon State homer who has not seen a whole lot of bowl games in recent history, who has not lived through a Rose Bowl for the team I cover. But I think all of these games have meaning. And particularly for teams that are on the rise or who have not been to these games in a while, they still have a lot of meaning. And maybe the opt-outs would tell you otherwise. And maybe the fact that ESPN's only talking about the college football playoff on game days tells you otherwise. But I still think to the true diehard college football fan, these games mean a lot. And if USC goes to the Rose Bowl, that fan base should be ecstatic about it.
I'm with you that it does mean more for some programs than others because depending on the bowl game, it can be disappointing, right? Like Ohio State didn't want to be playing in the Rose Bowl a year ago. They had a bunch of opt-outs, and it was still an awesome game. And I think the fact that they performed that well and showcased the talent that they had on the roster behind the guys who decided not to play, which I just don't. I guess I understand it at some level, but man, I'm just of the generation, but so are these kids who are a little bit younger that grew up watching these big games and a chance to play in the Rose Bowl. I don't know how you could decide not to do that. The smaller bowls, okay, I guess I understand, but I'm with you that winning that game and ending the season on that note can mean a lot for how you build a program. And it's not that it's entirely determinate of whether or not you're going to continue to have success, but it certainly doesn't hurt. You'd rather win. You get a little bit more money, a little bit more momentum. You're playing on national TV, right? Because these bowl games are still all televised and they run. I mean, I love watching the bowl games because I'm just a college football junkie. Maybe I'm old school. Maybe we're just old school guys as young guys Carter. We're just old school in that sense, and maybe we sound like guys, banging on the table. Back in my day, we didn't delegitimize anything. But I remember when I was younger, and I remember watching Jeremiah Masoli truck and Oklahoma State safety in the Holiday Bowl, and Oregon won that game, and it was awesome, and it was fun, and I wanted them to keep growing as a program, but it's about the building blocks and such. And I think that's why there are probably some USC fans who say, no, if you don't get in the playoff, you don't get to a national championship, then it's not successful. And to them, I'd say, did you really just not enjoy that Rose Bowl game at all? And from a conference perspective, bowl season is huge. Commissioners do not want to see the best players in their league opting out of these games because they want to put up a good record. And it has hurt the Pac-12, as we talked about earlier, to have not won a bowl game. I mean, that's bad. I think they've taken a major step forward this year. Oregon is much better. USC a big turnaround. Washington way improved. UCLA has taken that step into that upper echelon of teams in the conference. I think they've done a lot of things right on that particular front.
We do kind of maybe sound a little get off my lawn-y when we talk about this, but I think it's, college football changes so often, and we're going to have another discussion in a couple of years from now when we go to a 12-team playoff, and maybe this means a little bit less then. But now, here we are still in 2022 with 4 teams getting into the playoff. There are 127 other teams in college football that will not make the playoff, and most of them are going to be playing in bowl games in about a month and a half. Mm-hmm. And I have to think that, for 127 teams who are looking at the college football playoff on TV in January, sure, they're going to be thinking, man, I wish we were there, but are any of them going to regret playing in a bowl game? I don't think so, especially if it's a New Year's Six game, especially if you win your conference and you go to the Rose Bowl, or if you're a conference runner-up and you still get this awesome reward of going to the Cotton Bowl. These are huge games that 10 years ago, everyone would be talking about these things all year saying, man, I want to go to a New Year's Six game. I want to go to, back then, a BCS game. It's unfortunate that we're at a point now where so much of the conversation is around the college football playoff, and it makes sense because it's, that's how we determine a champion in this sport, but there are only so many teams that can get into that thing. And for everyone who can't, and for everyone who won't, I don't think that diminishes at all an appearance in, in any postseason game, really. I mean, you earned it. That's what you played the game for. That's exactly why you played a 12-game regular season, is to position yourself to play in a big game at the end of the year.
And you get a chance to showcase your skills against a team from another conference and play someone who you may be playing for the first time. You may never play again. There can be great games, exciting finishes, a lot of stuff. I remember the Alamo Bowl in, 2012, Washington at Baylor. It's one of the greatest college football games of the last decade. Are we going to just say, oh, no, it wasn't that fun because it was just the Alamo Bowl? No, it was just fun. And by the way, that's another component. Then we'll wrap up on this thought and get to the Beavs and a little bit of Washington talk ahead of their showdown with Oregon this week. But the other thing, too, is at the end of the day, college football is fun, right? And you only get so many chances as a fan base each year. If you're poo-pooing bowl season, no, this game doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything like that. Don't you want to watch your team play? Don't you want to watch your team? You having that emotional connection there. Regardless of, if you're playing in a lower tier bowl, well, you probably didn't have national championship aspirations in that particular season anyway, unless you're Texas A&M. But I think that was a completely warranted shot at the Aggies, who are a dumpster fire at the moment. But at the end of the day, going to bowl games, if you're in the right city, can be really, really fun. Part of a fun weekend. You can see players, you can see friends, you can meet. It's fun. I'm 100% pro bowl season, and I'm 100% anti college football playoff expansion. Every time I hear the term 12-team playoff, it's repulsive. It's absolutely terrible, which is probably how Carter felt a little bit on Friday night. And we have to get into his brain about that one because he has many thoughts, I am sure. And I have a couple questions. I want his thoughts. We'll get to all of that, but can we pause the pod for just a second? Okay, we're paused. We're not actually paused, but we're kind of paused. Great, because you got to try this. I'm talking about Built Bar's new reimagined flavors. Listen up, everybody. Cookie dough topper, coconut brownie bar, coconut brownie topper, white chocolate peppermint granola. If you think it's too early for the holidays, I might agree with you until I have anything peppermint related aside from my morning tea, in which case, I don't know. Kind of gets the Christmas vibes off and rolling. Go get yours now. Get 15% off by using the code LOCKEDON15 at built.com. That's 15% off your next order of Built Bars covered in 100% real chocolate, loaded with 17 grams of protein and just 130 calories. Built.com, promo code LOCKEDON15. Okay, Carter. So this is a free space to vent as you would like for what happened on Friday night. The Beavs were my only outright loser this week on Monday's show, meaning that not only did they lose the game, but that it felt like a situation where the fans were going to be especially disappointed. This is Wednesday's show. It's Tuesday evening. It's kind of like pre-evening, and whatnot as we're recording. I don't know. Anyway, it's Tuesday.
They call that the afternoon.
Something like that. But when does evening be? I don't know. Anyway, so I have to imagine that loss is still stinging at least a little bit. Maybe I'm wrong, but you and I talked about going in. That was the biggest game for Oregon State and Jonathan Smith's tenure. That was the biggest game for the Beavs football program in about a decade. They were in the top 25 and the college football playoff rankings. I believe it was the first time ever they were in the CFP rankings, in the AP top 25 for the first time in 9 years, and you come up 3 points short. What was your biggest takeaway from that game?
Not even the way that Oregon State lost or the fact that the Beavers lost, but just what that does for the rest of the season, I think is what makes it so disappointing for Oregon State fans. And I have to imagine to an extent for everybody who was on the sideline and in the locker room after that game, the stakes were so much higher than anything Oregon State has had at this point in the season in the last decade, that if you lose that game, you see your path to the Pac-12 title game, which was not really going to happen, but still mathematically possible. You see that go away. You see your shot at maybe, getting into, we're talking about bowl season, getting into the Vegas Bowl or jumping up to the Holiday Bowl. You see that fall off the table. Now you're playing for the Sun Bowl at best, most likely. You see a potential 10-win regular season fall off the board. You see a 3-game losing streak snapped. You see all of this momentum that you
winning streak, but yeah, we get the idea.
Sorry, yeah, that's what I meant.
You hope it doesn't trigger a 3-game losing streak.
Maybe that's just the Oregon State in me defaulting to losing. I don't know. Can't remember where I was in that train of thought, but I just the rankings too. I mean, Oregon State wins that game. It's a top 20 team, which again, we're talking about things that haven't happened in a decade. It feels like all of that momentum was lost, and Oregon State fully expects, I think, and the fan base expects to beat California this weekend, to go on the road to ASU next weekend and come out with a win there. And it just felt like, if Oregon State beats Washington, it's kind of on the home stretch there, could potentially win a bunch of games, maybe crack as high as the top 15, and all of a sudden Oregon State's in the national picture here. But all of that is off the table now. The Beavers aren't going to sneak into the rankings until maybe Oregon week, and that's
they could.
The Beavers win the next 2 games. I mean,
I could see that happening. By the way, you win the next 2, one of them's on the road, 8-3, with a tight loss to USC. They'd have a case. It'd probably be an instance where they're getting votes and they're not quite into it. But I wouldn't be totally shocked if they're back there.
Problem is right now too, Oregon State doesn't really have a quality win on its resume. I mean, you could look at Boise State maybe, but that was a much different team in week 1 than it is now. Fresno State, I suppose they're playing a lot better now that Hayner's back, but they haven't beaten really a quality Pac-12 team this year. Their non-conference was tough, and they went undefeated there. But like I said, those teams are looking a little different now than they did at that point in the season. And
they're okay.
It feels like, it feels like Oregon State's resume and the reason it's still receiving votes in the top 25 is because it has really quality losses. But it hasn't beaten anyone that we didn't expect them to, which feels weird to say about an Oregon State team, which is always good for an upset or 2 every year. But, that Washington game felt like that quality win opportunity and felt like, another monkey Oregon State needed to get off its back, losing in Seattle year after year after year. That's, again, where a lot of the disappointment comes from. It felt like that opportunity to say, hey, we've got something real on our resume now. Give us a little more respect, and they squandered it.
By the way, it would technically be losing in Seattle every other year after every other year after every other year. Of course. I was just trying to drown out your sorrows there with something that could make you chuckle. I think I succeeded.
They did beat Washington and Corvallis in 2021. So
Correct.
The losing streak in general to Washington had already been snapped, but they
Right.
hadn't won at Husky Stadium, I believe, since, man, I want to say like 2010 or something like that.
It's been a while. I want to talk about a couple things that transpired in that game. The third down defense was abysmal, and that was mostly because of a lack of a pass rush. The secondary had a bust on 3rd and goal from the 24. I still don't understand how that happens. I don't know how you don't plant your feet on the 5-yard line with 3 defenders and say, literally complete anything in front, will give you 15 yards, and you're still going to kick a field goal here. That was a mishap. But I want to ask you about those 4th downs, Carter, because I didn't like the first one. I was fine with the second one because it was a little bit longer of a field goal try, and the wind was really howling, and I understand that. But to me, and I felt this way in a number of games this season, I felt this way when Oregon was playing Cal, by the way, who's not as good a team as Washington. When you are on the road and you drive down into the red zone, it is disappointing to get stalled out. Yes, it's even more disappointing to walk away with no points. And the Beavs had a chance to take an early 10-0 lead, and they opted to go for it. And Jack Coletto rarely got stuffed. Doesn't happen very often. It did in that particular moment. I love the wrinkle they came with later where Coletto shifted and it was a lead block. It was a really great play to watch. But overall, I was okay with the second one. I was not okay with the first one. You have a chance against the Huskies on the road, take a 10-0 lead. There's something about being up 2 possessions that made me say, you got to just kick a field goal there.
So that's interesting to me because I'm kind of reversed. I was more okay with the first one than the second. And these were on consecutive drives, back-to-back offensive possessions for Oregon State. First one being a 4th and 1. And I know, I mean, it's literally a chip shot field goal. You're standing on the 7-yard line. That thing's a borderline gimme, even in that wind.
His extra points looked fine. It is barely longer than that. I think he would have been fine.
So my thinking on this, and this has been the case for quite some time now, is if you have Jack Coletto on your sideline, a 4th and 1, regardless of where you're at on the field, you could be on your own 35. Oregon State could be at its own 45. Jack Coletto in a 1-yard situation is just absolute money. Like, his conversion rate on that is so much higher than even attempting that field goal.
He's like Taysom Hill.
Exactly. I mean, he's almost automatic, and it's unfortunate actually that Oregon State was in a 4th and 1 on that first play because it had a 3rd and 1 on the play before. Coletto actually slipped and missed a block, and there were a couple other guys that missed blocks, and the Beavers were held for no gain. I felt like the Beavers, there was no way they were not going to come up with a yard 2 times in a row. And so I said, I understand wanting to take points here, but I was perfectly fine with them leaving the offense out there on that one just because of the yardage to gain. Now, the second one, a 4th and 3-ish, a long 3, kind of on the edge of probably where you feel comfortable because you're kicking into the wind towards the lake there. It would have been about a 30-yard field goal, which is no gimme, but with Everett Hayes healthy again, I think you have to like his odds of making that. 4th and 3 felt like, okay, we don't always trust Jack Coletto to pick up 3 yards. He was good for 1 or 2, but 3 is usually gravy. And the play that they designed for that was kind of a naked to Martinez out of the backfield, I believe it was, and Gulbranson overthrew him on the run. And it didn't feel like a great play design for a 4th and 3 going into the wind. I felt like the fact that the Beavers had been stopped on the first one, you didn't get points there. The second one felt like, hey, we cannot come up empty twice in a row. That's where I'd like to see Oregon State kick the field goal. And Smith again talked about, the 3 points is not guaranteed. If you don't get it, it's almost like you missed the field goal. But I just felt like if you came up empty on the first one, you got to try to take points on the second one. And they were a little too aggressive for my liking there.
Real quick, As you look forward for the rest of the season for the Beavs, I still think they're going to end up 8-4. I think they'll beat Cal. I think they'll beat Arizona State. And then Oregon is just, I mean, we'll see how the Ducks are playing, but they're really, really humming right now. And I think a loss like this does leave your locker room at least mildly more defeated. But how optimistic do you feel the Beavs could win out or at least get to 8 wins?
8 wins, I think, is it should be the expectation. California comes into Research Stadium on a 5-game losing streak, hasn't won since September. I know it gave USC a scare last week, but I think we'd be lying to ourselves if we thought the Golden Bears were going to come into Research Stadium, a place where no opponent has scored 17 or more than 17 points, where Oregon State has only lost 1 game in the last 2 seasons. I don't see that happening. And I think Oregon State going down to ASU, that's a spot going into the year that we felt the Beavers could take advantage of late in the year if things had unraveled, and they certainly have in Tempe. So I think the Beavers will be favored going into that ASU game, regardless of what happens against California. And then you get that big time matchup at Reser against Oregon, which Oregon will be favored and they're the better team, but it feels borderline coin flippy because it's in Reser. The Beavers have played so well at home. And I think they match up pretty well against the Ducks with that secondary going up against Oregon's passing attack, that the Beavers will have a very real shot to win that game. And so between those 3 coming out with 2 wins, that feels like the expectation. That feels like the floor for the Beavs. So 8 or 9 wins, again, still very much on the table. And you will take that 10 times out of 10 if you're an Oregon State fan.
Still plenty to play for Oregon State, and still plenty of opportunities to bring on my guy, Carter Bahns of BeaverBlitz.com, where he's a senior writer and editor. Appreciate the time, as always, my man. I appreciate all of you out there for listening to or watching the show. I will see you next time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.